Now, a brutal conflict has broken out again in Sudan, in Khartoum, in recent days. And the big media story here has been, understandably, how do we get British citizens out of there, and the government's various efforts to evacuate British passport holders and British workers from Sudan. However, a lot of people are also interested in how this conflict began and the various complicated dynamics of Sudan, which have largely been overlooked in recent years. So I'm delighted to be joined by Dr. Cirino Hiteng Ofuho, who is a former minister in the south of Sudan, and he's joining us now from Kenya. Dr. Cirino, thank you very much for joining us.
Most welcome.
Well, let's start with this latest eruption of violence. How did we get here? How did this conflict start? Give our viewers a little history of what's going on.
Thank you. In fact, this is the most unfortunate event in recent history that a war just broke out unexpectedly because, however, the crisis has been going on. There have been a lot of differences between the RSF and the Sudanese army since the fall of al-Bashir. And the RSF eventually emerged as a force that was coming to stabilize the aftermath of Bashir's collapse from power. And unfortunately, the RSF became a prevailing and dominant military force in Khartoum, and particularly within the center of power in Khartoum. First, there was a cooperation between Burhan, President al-Burhan or Commander al-Burhan and Hemeti, eventually, because they worked together in Darfur for many years. And so people saw that as maybe something that can bring good working relationship between the two. Unfortunately, for ideological reasons, these people fell out, particularly when they took over power from the civilian rule under Prime Minister Hamdok. In short, really, it was never expected that this brutal war could happen between Burhan and Hemeti, and rightly so, because behind it, really, which many people do not see and do not know, and maybe by now they have known, is behind this is actually the Islamists, the Islamists who were under al-Bashir, the National Islamic Front. And they are still there. They were hibernating behind, and they took advantage of this and triggered the crisis between Burhan and Hemeti. And this is where many people are shocked, are taken by shock, particularly Sudanese themselves. The experts who know the Sudanese politics will really find out that this was totally something that came up that struck like lightning between the two. But it is really the Islamists who are behind it, who want to come back to power in the Sudan, who are very upset with the emergence of Hemeti, and particularly the RSF, and that's why they refer to them as militia, and they don't really look at them as a military force like the Sudanese army, who are very proud military, who look at themselves as an army, a strong army in the country that fought many wars, that was able to defend the country against the SPLM, John Garang's Sudan People's Liberation Movement, Sudan People's Liberation Army, a very strong army that built over 20 years, that they resisted that and they were able to stand and until they signed peace and the South broke out.
Well, the RSF, we understand, grew out of the Janjaweed, who did become internationally recognized a few years ago because they were terrorizing particularly Christians in the south of Sudan.
In Darfur, yes.
In Darfur. How is it correct to see the RSF, the Rapid Support Forces, as the more vicious Islamist faction?
Actually, you are right there, because they are actually Islamists. They were initially trained as Islamists. There is very thin line of difference between the RSF and the Islamists now who want to take over power back in Sudan. In fact, the Janjaweed were up to now, including Hemeti, were still sanctioned by the international community because of the atrocities they committed in Darfur. In fact, nobody even expected the RSF to be legitimized now, as the way it happened after Bashir's collapse from power. And the little difference between the two, I think it has to do with the tradition of how the Sudanese army have been trained conventionally, and they look at themselves as a conventional army, unlike the RSF, who are always referred to as paramilitary, meaning that they are not really the same as the Sudanese army. And I can agree with you that I think the differences are very thin between the RSF when it comes to Islamic ideology.
And an oddity of this conflict has been that it's broken out during the end of Ramadan, which is meant to be a time of peace and reflection.
Absolutely. In fact, on a Friday, I'm told on the 14th, on a Friday, they had a dinner. And one of the leaders of the Transitional Council is General Malik Agar, who is the leader from Blue Nile, who was organizing to mediate between Hemeti and Burhan. And really, they did not expect this crisis to break out, especially during Ramadan. It was still shocking even to people like General Malik Agar. He never expected that this war was going to happen because he was one of the mediators, and he has always tried to play this role of being a moderate and having the SPLA background. And now one of the leaders of the SPLM North. So Malik was not really keen to see this kind of crisis unfolding.
And how do people in the South, you're from the South, how do people in the South feel about this conflict between what seems to be rival Islamic or Islamist groups in the North?
This is a very interesting question because actually many people in the South are divided. There are many who are sympathetic to the situation, but also a sizable majority who have never forgiven the North for what they did to the South have said, okay, let them test the salt of what they have always imposed on the South. It is unfortunate that many Southerners of that nature could look like, say, let us see the North boil into this because they have always put us in the South under similar circumstances. But the majority of Southerners also who are totally who probably spend a lot of their time growing and doing a lot of business or having gone to schools in the North, really feel the sympathy of what has happened. But otherwise, there are others in the South who says, yes, let the North test it. For over 50 years, the South has been subjected by Northern Sudanese elites under similar circumstances.
And what about the involvement of outside powers? I mean, I think in the West, there was a lot of concern about Darfur, but perhaps we turned our attention away from it because it seemed to have settled down. There seemed to be some sort of political settlement. And now there's a lot of talk in Western media about the role of Russia because of, I think, the Wagner group seeming to have some connection with, there's a Russian mercenary group seeming to have some connection with the RSF. Is this a case of Russia and the West sort of squabbling for power, or is it more complicated than that?
No, I think there has been, of course, that scramble for Africa, they call it now. Maybe you call it as another scramble for Africa, where Russia versus the West have been seen playing different roles. But I think there has been a larger involvement of the RSF leader, particularly Hemeti, with Russia and with other Middle East powers, mainly based on his engagement in business, in trade. He's a very big businessman. This Hamdan Daglo, Hemeti he has actually monopolized gold business in Darfur, in the Sudan, and has become the center of attention, particularly by Russia. And he has a connection even with the Wagner group, as we have all seen now. It's no secret. And so Hemeti has really had a lot of business with Russia, other than the West, like Britain or the United States of America.
You mentioned gold. Sudan is a very resource-rich country. Obviously, this is another troubling phase for it. But what do you think is an optimistic scenario for the future? How could this be settled?
This situation in the Sudan is really very, very volatile. And I think that many people never expected it, as I said it before. And the attitude of the leaders now, if you look at Burhan versus Hemeti, they have just signed this armistice, this truce, just to allow the evacuation of foreigners from Sudan. But they are not giving room. They have never given any signal of giving room for any talks or any negotiations. So for some of us and analysts who know similar conflicts, I'm very worried that it could turn out like Yemen or Syria.
Mm.
I'm actually impressed also by the response of the West, particularly Britain and the United States of America, and particularly Britain for that matter, having been the colonial power for Sudan and a government that has associated itself with Sudan for a long time, that they have responded quite very fast and putting large attention. And you hear British Foreign Secretary, US Secretary of State, all at least on daily basis have given a lot of their time to this. And I think that's an impressive part from that perspective.
Dr. Cirino, thank you very much for coming on to Spectator TV.